So since December, I wanted to make clips out of my streams so I can put them on my clips channel, TikTok, Instagram, and more. And usually what I would upload there are like tips and tricks about the character creation process, lighting, rendering, shading, and whatnot. And I think they're so valuable that I wanted to compile them all into one video so that more people might see it and get some more value out of them. So here are 50 tips and tricks about Blender you might not have heard before. How can we fill this up pretty easily? We're going to use the add brush. Take interpolation. Let's first of all see what it looks like without interpolation. That's what it looks like. It just adds a straight hair particle. If we enable interpolation, it does this. Ooh, magic basically. It basically tries to reshape itself according to the two strands that already exist, or these strands that already exist. So if it's closer to this one, it's going to look, closer to this one. If it's going to be closer to this one, it's going to look more like this one. If we do that a few more times, you can see we already have the front covered. And that's how easy you can create hairstyles. So this is basically a mask. I use masks more than actual colors because then if I use masks, I can plug them into, for example, a hue, saturation, and value node, and everything that's white will be affected by this node. So if you plug that back in and we, for example, say we change the hue, you can see nothing changes except for everything that was white. So I like to use masks more rather than actual colors because this way I can customize it even more. I can say where the color should change and then I can change the color in the node itself. So I have more flexibility basically. We're just gonna create a new image texture, make a new image, call it makeup. We're gonna start with black and then we're gonna add white. Basically white will be the parts that will have makeup. We're gonna use mix RGB. Put the color into the factor, and then we're going to bring the original color that we have currently into the first socket. Let's set it to a nice brown color. We can now go into texture painting. We can go into material preview up here, and we, for example, use the white value. We can see the makeup right there. We can also give her war paint if we want. Let's see what it looks like. I think that's a pretty good start. I actually found a trick how I did the wrapping around Vi's hands. What you need to do is you need to make your cylinder, for example, very small and then add some geometry in between. Make sure that these faces are quadratic, I guess. Then we move it into the arm and then we apply a shrink wrap modifier. This way it basically projects it onto the arm and then we have the perfect arm shape already. Perfect. And then we can use the shrink wrap. Looks horrible. I guess maybe project works better. So I guess we just have to move it down a little bit. We can still move it up later. I just want to get the general shape in. Apply that. We go into edit mode. Select all the faces and then Alt S. And you can see we can scale it on the normals of the faces. It's, of course, it doesn't like fully look like wraps because it's just like bands around your arm. It can go over one and then under the other and then you can't really see where it's ending. So you can kind of hide the fact that they're just like cylinders. If you have problems where to place the eyes height-wise, put them in the middle of the head or in the middle of the skull. If you don't know where to place the inner corner of the eye and then the outer corner of the eye, you can use two lines to determine that. First of all, take the outer part of the nose and draw upwards, draw a straight line upwards. That is generally on average where the inner corner of the eye begins. And then if you go to the lip, go here in the middle, we can draw a line from here through the outer, like the nostril, all the way to the end, and that's roughly where the eye ends. It can be a little bit further inwards, but that's just, like the average rule. The general rule to create characters that look forward is to place the iris in the middle of the white space of the eye or the eyeball. When this is the eyeball, the iris should be somewhere in the middle of this space here, which would be somewhere over here. Changing the skin above or changing the eyelids, the shape of the eyelids to bring the iris closer into the middle or moving the eyeball further outwards will give you that result. We can see like black lines, of course, for the hair, but we can also see these lines in between the hair. Of course, one reason for that would be because we don't have enough hair. Another reason could be because the hair is basically just going straight from the end to the beginning, so they don't really cover too much volume, I guess. If we increase twist though, they go diagonal and can this way kind of cover more space in 3D space, I guess. If I change the twist, for example, to 0.4, the lines in between the hair, they're not like straight lines anymore. They get a little bit, I guess, obstructed by the hair, which can make it look like there's more volume in the hair. If you need to work with a few hair strands, because, for example, it just takes too long to render or your PC can't handle it, then you can, for example, just slightly increase the twist to kind of create like this illusion of more volume in the hair. Maybe even some darker areas here. Create some more contrast here in the background too, you can see. Maybe even up here, add some more contrast to the background here. You want to highlight what the eye is supposed to see. So if you, for example, darken the background, you can focus on the subject. So if we darken the area up here, for example, where there's nothing, well, there's orange, but nothing else. So comparing that before and after, this is after, this is before. You can see the difference just by changing or by adding some highlights and shadows, how much that can change the image. To distinguish female and male skulls, what you can oftentimes see is that males have more like cube-like eye holes and females have more round eye holes. So we have a bigger jaw compared to the female one, for example, smaller eyes compared to the size, of course, and yeah, of course, the proportions are a little bit different because of how big the skull is overall. So we go into texture painting. If we go into texture painting into the brush settings right here, we have different settings here down there. We have texture, we have texture mask. I think we need to use texture. If we make a new texture right here, we can go into the texture settings down here to change what we want to use. So that's what I used. So now if I just draw it, you can see we draw the clouds. To make it a little bit more, I guess, interactive or a little bit easier to use, we can switch it from tiled to random, or we can also set it to stencil. Then we can get this one right here. And then if we place it somewhere, you can then draw it and then it perfectly draws it on there. Let me just quickly deactivate symmetry because symmetry destroys the look. If we do it again, you can see we can draw it on the sphere. And then we have the texture on the sphere. One rule for the thumb position that is actually pretty important and pretty simple to recognize. Looking at the thumb like this, for example, you can see how these fingers, looking at the fingernail as, let's say, their finger normal, they point upwards. Same for this one, same for this one, same for this one. But then the thumb points to the side. So in general, on average, the thumb has a 90-degree rotation compared to all the other fingers. The easiest way to simplify a reference is to look at the silhouette, because the silhouette tells you a lot about a character. It basically simplifies the character almost completely into one single shape that you can then maybe even simplify it even more to kind of gather the simplest shape that you can turn something into. What makes characters unique and I guess recognizable is most of the time their silhouettes, or it's one big factor. The silhouette is something very, very easy to see for humans. You know, my hand, you can see like what the outline is. You can immediately see that it's a hand. You don't have to look at the structure that is like over here somewhere. So if we want to create a character that looks like this one, let's look at the silhouette and see what makes up the silhouette and what's make the silhouette unique to other characters that we can then transfer over to our character. If we now, for example, remove the silhouette, we can see what the general shapes are basically. A way to show if you're overexposing the light or if you can still increase the light strength or power is you can go to the render settings. And then in color management, there's a view transform false color. That tells you how bright an area is. If it's red, it means it's overexposed or it's white. If it's blue or black, it means there's no light. So right now you can see we have white areas on the hair and everything else is sort of in the middle. So if we now increase the strength to 200, for example, you can see we get more red on the model. If you set it to 500, even the forehead gets red. If we now switch this back to the real colors, that's what it looks like. I think what is sort of missing right now is the objects are connected, but they're not interacting with each other. You can see they are inside of each other, okay? But they're not interacting with each other, okay? What you could do to make them interact with each other is you could use the sculpt tools. And once you've added all these things and you don't want to change anything anymore, you can go in here, for example, with the crease brush. You could just create a crease right here. The crease makes it so that they interact with each other. The metal is not part of the skin. So by creating this crease, it looks like it's been put into the skin. The skin needs to avoid or needs to move around the metal. And this way, it basically interacts with it. Now that you've created one that is pretty, I guess, soft or shallow, you could say, try to see which the deep and high spots are, or the protrusions and cavities. Maybe highlight those more than they need to be. Make the deep spots very, very deep. Make the high spots very, very high, just to kind of get a feel of how much you can work with the sculpt and how the sculpt tools like work. You said this is the first sculpt that you've ever made. The more you do, the more sculpts you do, the more you're going to improve, of course. Especially in the beginning, it's going to feel like you're going to improve so much in the beginning, especially. So, you know, this one, comparing this one to maybe your fifth one will look way, way different. The geometry node here, using the pointiness output, we can use it for discolorations, or we can use it for dirt in between seam lines. So we're going to specify this a little bit more. We're going to make it darker. I want to have it only in the seam lines or in the seams. So we're going to make everything white except for the dark parts. The white edges are basically positive angles, I guess, and the black edges are negative angles. Angles that are close together and angles that are far apart. I want to increase the grime and dirt in the ones that are close together, and then I want to remove it where they're far apart, basically. It looked like this. We need to apply it to the color 2. I think it's too much though, so we're going to reduce it a little bit. Yeah, that's pretty good. So you can add a box, just a normal cube, and you can add a material to it, which includes a principal volume shader. You need to put that into the volume socket, and there you go. Now we have some fog. You can then decrease the density to make it less dense, and this way you can create an atmosphere, add an atmosphere to the scene. That's also what fog does. It creates these light rays. It also kind of alludes to an atmosphere. The atmosphere you can see on this planet in this blue outline, but you can also see it on this planet with this fading out the further you go away from where you stand with either the character in here, for example, or with the camera. You can probably use weight maps. You can create some weight maps to distinguish where plants should be and where plants shouldn't be. And then you can also increase the random distribution in the particle settings if you use particles. If you use geometry nodes, you can still use weight maps, but I think the random distribution is actually intrinsic to the point distribution. So you can, for example, remove the plants off of this cliff right here or from here. There isn't really that much grass. There shouldn't probably be that much plants either. Maybe adding a few more big ferns, maybe adding a few trees to the different looking trees to the scene, maybe adding a few rocks to the scene that are smaller, bigger, just scattered around the environment. I think that can also add to a more natural look. Hair is usually so dense that you can't really see through the hair strands. Of course, if you part it, you can see through it or you can see the gap, but usually you can't really see it because it's so thick. One way you can kind of minimize the effect of seeing the skin underneath the hair is you could darken, or you could create basically like a texture that already adds like a layer of hair. This way it colors the bald head darker. This way you can't really see that there's no hair there. This might just be the preview, but I think adding more hair, of course, would also be a solution. If you want to give a character big arms, the big upper arms don't come from the biceps. The biceps is actually pretty thin. Look at this. You can see there's a clear slope. This is the widest part right there. But then you can see the biceps is thinner than the triceps. Generally speaking, the triceps takes up roughly like a 2/3 of the upper arm and the biceps is only 1/3. This is the biceps right there. Then we have a smaller muscle that is sort of underneath the biceps. And then we have the triceps here in the back. You can see how much space it takes up compared to the biceps. It contributes the most to the side view size and also the front view size. That's what gives the arm its thickness, because the triceps is not made out of one muscle, but of two, which are right next to each other. So he exists in real life, as you know. And if you look at him, you can probably see him in this face. You can probably see they captured likeness. Why is that? To capture a likeness, you need to basically capture the proportions of somebody. So how long is the nose? How wide are the eyes apart? How big are the eyes? How big are the eyebrows? How high above the eyes are they? How wide is the nose? And so many different proportions that you need to keep in mind. And if you capture them right, you can capture the likeness of somebody. But there's more than just the proportions in somebody's face. And that's what you can simplify. With these Fortnite style, for example, we have sharp corners in the face to define structures of the face. Like, for example, the chin right here. It was a circle with 3 layers. That is sort of supposed to describe what limits you as an artist. What might be the reason that your art, maybe, for example, why it's sort of stagnating or always looks sort of the same. You know, you might be interested in cars or in machines and cyborgs and beautiful men. That's sort of the, I guess you could say, comfort zone. You know how to do it. You know what looks cool. And then you kind of go from there. Then the interest zone. you still learn more, but you're still limited by the range of topics that you have. And if you increase the sort of zone of interest, you can learn even more because you have more to explore. So that if you then say, hey, you know, I also like animals, and then you can look at animals and you can incorporate, you can learn what animals look like, what sort of cool traits they have. You learn more about them and you can incorporate that into your art too. And thus you can kind of think how much more diversity you can get and you can put into your characters, and how much, I guess, more unique they can look. You know, now that I know that kids have the same eye size as adults, my theory is even more correct. Like, it always seems like big animals have big, small eyes, and small animals have big eyes, and that's sort of one big characteristics how you can sort of make an animal look big or small. That's why flies in comics always have like your huge eyes, and then, I don't know, like elephants always have like very, very small ones, or whales too. I think the eye size in general pretty similar between animals. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, you know, mice don't have the same eye size as elephants, of course, but I would say there's a certain connection between eye size and body size. If you ever run into the problem that you have a mesh that is sort of intersecting with another one, or one that is just too close, which means that if you then use any brush and you want to only affect this surface here, for example, and you use your brush, you can see sometimes it works. Sometimes if the brush is too big, you can affect both of these, especially if you want to, for example, just move it like this. It doesn't really work that well. So what you can do is you can use your mask brush. You go to the surface that you want to affect, and then you hover over it. You press Shift A, which creates this proximity selection. You can see it still jumps to the other surface, but if you press 3, you can switch to the topology mode, I think, where it only selects what is connected, the faces that are connected, which means you can select only the teeth and then you can change them. If you're new to something, like sculpting, for example, if you're a beginner in sculpting, doing quick projects every day, or maybe even, you know, one after the other, can help a lot when you want to manifest a new workflow, for example. Especially if you want to learn the basics, it helps you with that because you can't get lost in details because you don't have time working on them. That's one advantage in these quick sketches, and especially doing them when you're a beginner in sculpting, for example. See, now I could just press D to change to the other mesh, and then I could just move it up. Alt Q? Why? Why? That's weird. Why does it have this new effect? I've never seen that effect before. That's cool. Look at that. Like a power up. I used it in 2.93, but they changed it. Before you could just press D, but apparently now D's not good enough anymore. They needed to invent a new hotkey for it. So now it's Alt Q. Looks like looks like the sculpt takes damage. The one thing that you can do to really improve the look of any clothing, especially for this one, for example, first thing is seam lines, so that you can show that it's made out of multiple pieces. You kind of always have to think about how would you put the clothing on. Well, if it's very stretchable, maybe you could get into it. I think it's just easier to add some seam lines to make it visible that it's still a full bodysuit, but it has, you know, certain areas where you can sort of see that it's been manufactured, and not just kind of, I guess, created out of nothing. And then one more thing is folds. Folds can really quickly improve the look of any clothing. When it comes to the gloves, or when it comes especially to the armpits, maybe even here in the crotch area, just adding some folds can really quickly improve the look of any clothing, basically. So if you ever want to rotate something big, for example, if you want to pose a character, you can either use the pose tool, or you can also use the rotation tool, the transform rotate tool. The way you do that is you go ahead and you mask the thing that you want to either rotate or not rotate. You go ahead and go down here to the rotate tool. There you go. For the cursor to be in the middle, you need to deactivate symmetry. First of all, I'm going to invert this because I want to move the lower part of the mouth. Then we're going to go to the sculpt, set pivot to mask border right there, and then we can just rotate it. This way you can very easily move stuff that you like, limbs or like arms or heads. I like to use that for these quick sketches because it's very useful to just quickly pose a character, for example. The way I like to create horns is, first of all, I'm going to grab my mask brush, which is this one down here, this one. But then I'm gonna draw the shape that I want the horn to be. That would be the horn shape. We're gonna fill it out, and then we're gonna invert the mask. Now we're gonna switch to the snake hook brush, which is this one. And then we're gonna go to the fall off setting right here on the right side. And we're gonna switch that from smooth to linear. And then once we have that, we can just go into the middle of this drawn shape and we can pull it out. We can make the cursor quite big and then we just zip, and there you go. If we go a little bit further, we can create some nice horns. The thing about linear fall off is that it basically changes the tip of the horn. So smooth will have a smoother tip and linear will have quite a pointy tip. If you're not quite happy, you can just still use the smooth brush by just holding shift to kind of refine it a little bit. So if I place this now on his nose, for example, there you go. The depth of field right now is quite big. If we reduce it to 0.4, which is what I usually do, you can see the nose is still pretty sharp. But if you go to the horn, for example, you can see the edge gets kind of blurry. And the further it's away from the focus plane rather, as you can see there, the blurrier it gets. Really useful for if you want to make your sculpts a little bit more realistic. Oh, you mean when you basically have a side view of a character and then you have a front view of a character and then you set it up in a way where you can create the 3D character basically by tracing the images? I guess it's only cheating if you want it to be. What I mean by this, it depends on what kind of goal or what kind of context it is. If you're in a studio, in a movie studio or game studio, and you're supposed to create a character from a concept, from a character sheet concept, for example, and you then use that technique to create the character, I wouldn't say that that's cheating or whatever, because it more depends on what your goal is with whatever you're doing or where you're using that technique. But if you want to, for example, learn human anatomy, or you want to learn to sort of train your eye to bring something that is 2D into 3D, then you could consider it, I guess, cheating, because you don't do it with just your eyes, but actually by tracing it. The ratio of hip width to shoulder width varies by gender. The average ratio for women is 1:1. For men is 1:1.8. Male shoulders are wider, basically. And women's shoulders are, well, compared to the hips, are just as wide. Leg to body ratio, it seems, is seen as an indicator of physical attractiveness. Oh no, I don't know if I can show that. So we're gonna go to modifiers. We're gonna go to the array modifier. We're gonna select the array modifier, and then we're gonna set the count to 7. We then go into orthographic view. If you have a numpad, you can press 1 to get there. If you don't have a numpad, you can go to view, viewpoint, right here, and then you select front. We need to now use these 7 eyes and make them as wide as the head is. So we're going to select the eyes, we're going to move it on the head, and we're going to scale them down until they basically touch both ends of the skull. So not just any part of the skull, not down here, not up there, the widest part of the skull, which should be somewhere above or on the eyebrow level. And that looks pretty good. This would be like a male eyeball size, for example, because oftentimes females have smaller heads. You can also say for females, you could, for example, scale it up so that 6.5 eyeballs is the width of the head. One thing that you can notice, or what you usually have for the neck, is that the neck basically goes straight down. What you can see here is that the connection of the neck muscles that are on the sides here, that basically help you to rotate your head, these two here, they start behind your ear or underneath it, connect to the head, and then they go down to the to this bone right here. And they generally only get narrower, which means that they start off very wide and then of course go into the middle. Of course there are some more muscles on the side, but if you generally speak and look from the front at a face, what you can see is that the neck, you can see it here, how it goes down, and then to the side, it tapers down, like right there. This one here too, you can see the same. It goes straight down, and then it goes to the side. There are 3 different maps, I guess, for displacements in 3D. Bump maps are really only for moving stuff up and down. Same for normal maps, but with normal maps, you can store more detailed because you have not only 2 colors, black and white, and a gradient, I guess, between the 2, but you have 3 colors for normal maps, so you can store even more detail. But then there's a third one, which is called vector displacement maps, that you can see here, where you can use, you can also just have a RGB map like this one here, but the colors are set up in a different way. It gets interpreted a little bit differently, which means that it doesn't just move vertices upwards, but it also moves them to the side. And this way you can create all these crazy pieces here out of these things here, you know? Just by using one map you can create that, which is pretty crazy. I think an important thing, if you look at feet have different ankles or different joints in them. They're basically made out of different segments, which enables them to bend. What I always thought about is like this, that the foot bone is basically like this. Okay. But the foot bone is more something like this. And then you have one more right here, and then you have one more right here, which means that you can rotate them. You can sort of bend them a little bit, which can lead to feet looking more like this, where you have like a V shape like this for your foot. If the foot would look like this, usually the foot is quite straight, but you can also bend it a little bit to make it look something more like this. Let's see if there's a function for that in the settings. Preferences, I mean. Okay, I mean, that works, I guess. Good to know. That'll increase my efficiency even more. If you want to cycle between, for example, the layout and sculpting tab, what you can press is you could press Control and page up or down to either switch to the next workspace or to the previous one. So page up goes to the next one and page down goes to the previous one. I only have 2 workspaces right now, but that's how you can cycle between workspaces and work just a little bit faster, I guess. Well, if you want to focus on any part of the body, one thing that you should always keep in mind is that you include at least part of the peripheral limbs that are included in that. So if you want to sculpt, for example, if you want to train your upper body sculpt, you need to at least a little bit include the shoulders too. They might be part of the arms, you could consider them part of the arms, but they're very important so you can practice where to place the pectoralis muscle or the chest muscle. Because the chest muscle needs to connect to the upper arm muscle or to the upper arm bone, and without it you can't really place it anywhere. You could maybe pull it apart or to the side a little bit, but without it it's really hard to place them in the right position. How I always kind of imagine where to place the muscles is I kind of think about the attachment, and that's how I sort of place my muscles. And if you don't have anything to attach it to, it's really hard to get them right. You could maybe say that you oftentimes have a small line here, which basically indicates the fat that is attached to the side of the nose basically and runs down to right here. It basically goes from here downwards to here. This fat pad right here. This fat pad is basically the fat pad that creates this little crease that you can oftentimes see in people. It kind of runs from the side of the nose downwards next to the nostril, which creates this very stark crease here. He kind of added a little bit, and then it goes to the side and then next to the mouth corner basically. Maybe you could consider smoothing the side a little bit and adding like a small little crease here so that it looks something like this basically. If you want to make something very, very sharp, I guess the best way to do it would be just to use the smooth brush. So if you ever think, oh, I want to have something that is ultra sharp, just use the smooth brush over and over and over again. The only problem is if you do it too much, you can see it can create something like this. So tapping is better. If you want to fix this again, the best way probably to do that would be to use dynamic topology or dyne topo, and then you can just tap it again and then it retopologizes, I guess, this geometry, which makes it less dense. And that solves the biggest problem when you want to get rid of it, because if you smooth it and you smooth it more and more and more, you can see it gets more and more resistant to the smoothing because there's already so much geometry in this one spot. I like to enable or increase the resolution, maybe to 50 should be enough. And I just apply more geometry here to the head where I want to add the hair. What I then like to do is I like to use my mask brush, draw some small little dots here like this, because we now have more resolution. I can actually do that. Then I like to invert it, use my snake hook brush, and then I just pull it out. Woo! And then we have little hair. Looks kind of weird, but what we can then do is we can first of all smooth it to make it sharper, and then we can also just kind of twist it a little bit, make it smaller, give it some structure, for example, like this. Of course, symmetry kind of destroys the natural look, but that's how I like to add hair sometimes if it has to be, you know, if it doesn't need to be like super detailed, for example. I remember at one point at a party, we played the game where you have to draw and others have to guess what it is. And I was tasked to draw a koala. I think a koala is somewhat recognizable, or everybody has like an image in their head what a koala looks like. I think it was recognizable, but I afterwards sort of looked up what a koala looks like, and it looked completely different. And that's always what I think about when I think about like, oh, do I need reference for this? Yeah, you do. You always do. We're gonna select this, invert it, and then there's the blob brush. I think that's supposed to make this round. If we use it now with front faces only enabled, maybe accumulate, it should make it round like this. And then if we do it on the other side, make it nice and round. And then if we do it here, ooh, look at that. That was pretty cool, actually. I actually never used the blob brush, but I think for these kind of sculpts, it works quite well. See how quickly we've just created this little antenna blob here at the bottom, just with this little line here. Any reason you use Pinterest? At this point, looking up all the quick sketch references, I'm sort of used to using Pinterest. For example, if I know I just open Pinterest, it shows me what I always look for or what I saved. For example, my pins right here. You know, those are all my pin boards. So if I ever see some sort of image that I think, oh, that looks pretty cool, like this one, for example, I could save it in my, in a specific board, like creatures, for example. There you go, and then it's saved. You can't really do that on Google. You know, I can create a selection of images really, really quickly. Then if I ever need to look up, I want to get some inspiration. Then I go into this. I can see all my pins here, get some inspiration from this one, or if I need more, I can just go to more ideas, and then I find images that look somewhat like the one that I already saved. Did you know that you can actually use a negative power value so that the light source actually becomes a dark hole and you can absorb light from the scene? So we can make it, we of course can set it to 0, but what if we set it to -1000? Oh wow, what is that? Oh no, what is that? Oh, because it's orange, so it absorbs all the orange color. So you only see, the opposite, which is blue. So if you set this to saturation 0, it gets black. So we can make dark hole lights like this. You can probably create some pretty cool effects with this. Look at that. If you're removing, or if you're trying to add like a texture to a surface like this one, like these sort of lines here, these creases, it is always helpful to define them more by not only going in and doing it subtractively like this, but also then afterwards doing it additively. So what we can do here, for example, is we can use the clay strips brush now, and we can just kind of add more volume here to the middle part, to the flat part, make it a little bit rounder, and this way sort of accentuate the structure even more, give it more contrast basically. And then once we have a little bit more volume here, we can then just use the smooth brush, and this way we can add some more contrast to these lines, I guess. There you go. All brushes have a frequency with which they are applied. You can see the frequency here in the stroke settings. You can see the spacing is basically 6%. So when you stroke with your brush, if the stroke has reached 6% of the brush's size, it applies the brush again. So if you want to have very, 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 I guess, fine brush strokes, you can set it to 1%, then it's smoother. It also gets laggier though, so that's one thing to keep in mind. And then if you set it to 100, for example, you can also space them out more. So it looks more like a little dotted pattern. See, there you go. You can draw these lines basically. You want to have like these small little, like a line of dotted small little horns. You can use that, for example. What do facets do? Faces are basically masks, but you can have multiple masks. So you can color code masks. So I can make this a facet. I can make the ear a facet. I guess they're not really masks. Face sets are a little bit different. You can basically color code different parts of your sculpt to organize it a little bit better. So if I now, for example, want to sculpt behind this ear, I can now press Shift H to hide the ear, and then I can work on behind the ear. If you press Alt H, you can bring everything back. Or if you press H, I think, you hide everything that is where your cursor isn't over. So if I hover my cursor over the blue face set, you can see everything gets hidden, except for the blue one. If I press Shift H, you can see everything, or only the blue one gets hidden. The benefit of using face set is if you go to the pose brush. The pose brush is somewhat janky if you use the rotation origin topology setting, because it kind of has to find the anchor point for the bone that it creates here. You can see it kind of jumped over to somewhere over here. But if you have your object color coded, you can then set it from topology to face sets, and then it always latches onto the border of the face set. See how if I move my cursor, it always sticks to the border right there, and I can then just kind of rotate it like this. That's the hairstyle for Jinx without the strand, of course. We have this invisible model underneath, or for the hair, basically just to separate the hair so you can move it around. You can kind of, I guess, scale it or whatever you want, but mainly also because then it's easier to set up your hair materials. You can also just apply the hair particles to your model. The problem will then be though that the hair particle systems always kind of start at the surface of your model. The problem there is that basically you can sometimes see hair strands sort of floating in midair, because sometimes they have a slight distance between the surface and the where the hair strand begins. So what you would usually do is you would duplicate the head where the hair would emit from, and then you would basically shrink it down just a little bit so that all the hairs start from within the head, basically.